I'm Reverend Dr. Carla Cheatham. I'm one of the members of the board. This is Reverend Dr. Jaime Romo, who is another member of our board, as well as Bethany Britton, who's another board member. So we will each be tag teaming this afternoon as we talk about our presentation on handling the sticky widgets. How in the world do we have conversations about child maltreatment within communities of faith? So to begin, what we were hoping to do is get a little bit of information from you about who is here in the room with us this afternoon for this presentation. We want to make certain that we know who you are, why you're here, and exactly what it is that you need so that in 90 minutes you will walk away feeling like you've gotten something useful and helpful tomorrow when you go back into your places of work or whenever it is that you return to your communities and the respective work that you do, whether it's professional or volunteer or both. So I'll first start by asking this. Who of you are here today as social workers? Okay, handful of those. Any in the medical field, physicians, nurses? Excellent. Those here as chaplains or clergy? Persons who are child protective workers or child development specialists? Excellent. Others in the legal profession? Okay, other disciplines that I'm missing? Yes, what am I missing? Clinicians, therapists. Excellent. Education? Family members of those who've been impacted and survivors as well. Yes, other child advocates. We mentioned child caseworkers and child development specialists. Others? Church educator. Fantastic. Well, thank you for being here, and we're looking forward to sharing from your wisdom and experience for the latter half of our presentation, where we'll be having a lot of dialogue about how exactly we do this. What are the barriers that we face in trying to help communities of faith have such conversations? And what are some of the talking points that we can use? And is there specific language that we might use within communities of faith? And are there ways that we can help ourselves stay calm when we get frustrated to the point that we want to slap the snot out of somebody? How do we navigate with our own frustration and tension when we feel so passionately and strongly and there's so much woundedness that we've seen and or experienced? How do we keep our stuff together so that we can be an instrument of transformation and change and not in the midst of our passion and anger and frustration push back so hard that we become a wall rather than a bridge for conversation? So that's what we hope to get to today. So at this point, I'm going to just look briefly at the goals that we're going to go over. We do want to talk about, as I mentioned, those barriers, the risks, not just for institutions, but also for survivors, the benefits and the responsibilities, as well as what are some of those talking points for these conversations that we might have. So with that, I'll hand this over to Jaime.
Thank you. Can you hear? Hey, well, good afternoon. We really want to have this be a conversation, and so we'll give you some information up front that really is congruent with what I've heard in the earlier presentations about culture. You know, culture, the way that we connect with others, the way we have a sense of identity and how to get along and what's important and what's right. And so we'll start off talking about culture, but I guess I just want to disclose one of my goals for all of you is that besides becoming more familiar with, basic prevention or intervention strategies or sharing experiences and actually becoming more of this healing community. I mean, as I have been in the room, I've really been struck by how individuals can make such a huge difference, how there's some extraordinary pioneers and leaders in the room, and that collectively, this is a very special gathering, but collectively we can continue to share best practices, what we're learning, and be more effective in creating a space for more of this learning, for more of the cognitive dissonance that too often people don't get, that will really help save lives, literally. I hope that you would also consider, and we'll talk about it later, then engaging communities in the designation program that we're developing, to have congregational or community conversations and learn more, to be able to affirm something like the Child-Friendly Faith Charter, And again, we'll talk about that more later. And that even down the road, that every community that you're a part of is a safe and a healing environment, and that it has certain components in it, not just individuals who are torchbearers, but a shared knowledge base, an increased competency, skill set, language that people can actually speak to protect and help others heal. And there are resources and policies that would go to be institutionalized as well, so that you are these change agents. So all of that to me is part of what I hope for today. Is a difficult and awkward conversation it can be to deal with child maltreatment and abuse, that we are able to bring our experiences, our perspectives, our questions, and learn from one another. And I know for me, to do that, I would want to know that this is a space that honors confidentiality, and that you don't give each other permission, it's just we think we have permission to share what conversations you've had here and other places. That we're open to different perspectives, and that we're all in process, learning from our experiences, integrating and drawing some lessons from those experiences, and that it's a good thing to change our mind, but that we're open to that initial maybe dissonance or perspective that may seem difficult to reconcile. And that as safe as we can be in this physical space and in this group, that for whatever reason you need to take a time out or just, take care of yourself, that's really important. We don't learn if we're not safe. We don't learn as trauma does, it helps people feel unsafe, not trust, feel voiceless, feel powerless, have no choices. Well, we want to create an environment that's the opposite, that it is safe, that you can trust taking care of yourself and trust expressing, bring your voice, that it's overall empowering. Is there that helps me? Is there anything we need to add before continuing on? Does everybody want you to be able to be present and to engage? Is that good enough? Okay, thank you. So then this slide, I didn't know that it would match so much. It's a kind of a grid. It says cultures regarding abuse and maltreatment. There we go. And the top column, going from action logic to the left and then to the right, seems to represent one part of the continuum. Right? Those that in some way actively enact abuse and maltreatment or really enable it. And the second that says conscious incompetency hidden or conscious incompetency private seems to represent that place of cognitive dissonance that our last speaker, Laura Aaron Fontes, spoke of. That people can go from thinking that something is right to not being so sure. And I think in that not so sure stage, individually as well as collectively, there's this ambivalence, where people may start to realize that certain practices or ways of thinking about things are not okay. But when they really become, so that you might think of just kind of being oblivious to really being ambivalent, knowing there's something to be done but not knowing how. And that's where it says conscious incompetency. 2, being an advocate, being willing and able to take that personal knowledge and do something with it, speak up, intervene in some way, take that risk to create a space. And cultures do change. I mean, the classic, maybe traditional view of culture is that it's like a land anchor. It holds things firm, and they don't move. And I think a more helpful way of thinking of culture, as opening speaker talked about food. We hold on to some things, we modify the things, and we leave some things. It's more of a sea anchor. Right? It shifts a little bit, but it still holds some basic things in place. But if we don't adapt, if we don't let go of some ground in some areas, we sink. Right? So I just wanted to frame to begin that cultures frame a lot of these religious settings that we're a part of. And it's maybe easier to talk about sexual abuse than it is in some cases talked about child maltreatment, or conversations will happen throughout the conference of withholding treatment or using a way of thinking, belief system to punish but not injure, which I struggle with, because there's physical injury, but then there's also all kinds of other injury that is very damaging. Right? So some numbers around sexual abuse is that it's widespread. In congregations, that there are currently, this is a study about a year and a half ago, 3% of women who reported having been the object of clergy sexual misconduct. And on. So that women certainly have a high incident of physical and sexual violence. Another aspect of abuse is that it's so prevalent in places where there's no way to really name it. There's no way to really speak to it. And those organizations are particularly vulnerable for people who do wish to do harm to attend. So Jerry Sandusky took his victims to church, where no one would believe that someone who was doing so much good could actually be grooming the congregation to allow, not question his behavior. I've spoken with church leaders who have said, yes, I know I have a registered sex offender, but, there's nothing going on, and, it would just cause chaos if anybody else knew about this. So that, in their head, that was a way to manage something, but not have a language. And I'll speak to how dangerous that is in a moment. And maybe the ministers, people who have been to seminaries in the room can speak to how well prepared you were to deal with abuse prevention or intervention, anything like that. And it's a relatively new conversation. We have great underreporting. It was just a conversation at a table, a brief conversation, even about males and abuse and different abusers by gender. And there's so much underreporting as a given for so many reasons. And part of the shame, the silencing, the self-silencing, the threats, in part that there are not a lot of people who may be ready to take in reports, to hear from someone and to believe them. And that leads to all kinds of physical and emotional, spiritual illness. Some person recently wrote a dissertation and talked about trauma as spiritual dissociation, and trauma as wounds where there's no blood. And so we have all kinds of internalized wounds that lead, if some of you are familiar with the ACE study, Felidi's work, and it's a gold mine of research to point to how these different experiences, these internalized false beliefs about ourselves, and the physical and emotional trauma that we experience or that we're exposed to, or the neglect that we experience, not being treated as we need it to be treated, how that correlates directly to physical and emotional psychic damage, and then to self-destructive and other destructive behaviors. And it should be undeniable, although there seems to be a lot of denial around that. So more and more people would talk about the impact of not just sexual abuse, but other child maltreatment as leading to PTSD, as leading to anxiety disorders, depression, and again, physical disorders, self-destructive and other destructive behaviors, and making someone more vulnerable even then to trafficking and other exploitation. So these are really linked. There's this network, this pipeline that too often starts and is reinforced through institutions that we value. So I'd like to tell you a story about my church called Pilgrim, United Church of Christ. Real progressive place, not very big, 300 members. Very much about social justice, a lot of smart people, activists, and open and affirming, thinking, everybody's welcome here. And even people we don't agree with. And in 2007, a registered sex offender showed up and said, I'm out of prison, I've done my time, here's everything you need to know about me. I've just moved into the area, I want to be up front with you, I'd like to join, I'd like to attend. People didn't know exactly what to do at the time. They had no plan. They were consciously incompetent. They were in denial about all kinds of experiences that their own members had had. 20% of any congregation is going to have sexual abuse experience. And they said, okay, well, let's introduce the person at the next service. And they did that. The congregation, I think, thought, great, we're open, we'll figure this out. Other half, not so great. A lot of people got triggered. And a short story was someone from the neighboring preschool, not a member, went to the media. All of a sudden, we were on this national newscast and being followed for months of like, how are we going to handle this? Meanwhile, people were, just going through re-traumatization about how a person who represented their life, the horrible parts of their life experience that had never been resolved, that in some cases maybe people had tried to bring in the church but had really not gotten a satisfactory response. So they felt this betrayal. And so it had layers and layers of this unresolved trauma that just came up. And it was a very traumatic experience, for several months while we figured out what to do. And so what the chart represents was that we were in that first stage, really. We had no idea what to do, in denial that, people would come into this or any other setting with a capacity or a history to do harm to children, to vulnerable adults, when in reality that had happened in the congregation's own story, and people knew it, but hadn't really talked about it. Or some people had left, and so it wasn't a current issue. People were in crisis, people were in react mode, and looked to some kind of compliance. Oh no, we're going to lose membership, we're going to close our doors, we're going to be sued somehow. And that threw us into this struggle, the conscious incompetency. So as a group, as an organization, we were there for a while, very fear-based, trying to implement policies in a very mechanical way, again, with the idea that somehow adding something to the congregation would change the culture. As time went on, and there were more conversations and more ways that members who were suffering were supported, and more educational programs that were implemented, as well as policies, we, I think, started to become more consciously competent, really striving to be more of a healing and safe community. And people began to, I think, monitor themselves and have different kinds of programs that help people to have more language about maltreatment in its many forms. I won't say that we're at unconscious competency at this point. So this is a good place to invite Bethany, who came to our congregation in the spring, and we held a forum. It was a wonderful experience for everybody, but also not without challenge.
Thank you. I can tell you that Pilgrim was indeed welcoming. It was a very open and warm church. I'm a survivor of religiously motivated child maltreatment and have become outspoken. And for the most part, all the places I've gone were places that were non-religious, so it's fairly easy to tell my story. Going to Pilgrim was the first time that I was going to be up in front of a church, and I'd had church experiences before. In fact, a friend invited me to Episcopalian church and held my hand while I sat by the door because I just knew I was going to have a panic attack and need to bolt. So now I was going to be speaking in one. And when I got there, it was one of those things where I said yes and figured I'd find courage later. And Jaime and I went to the church the day before, and he said, let's just walk into the sanctuary and you can get used to it. And I had gone to church even after my abusive experiences and just made it okay. It was just like, I'm just going to make this okay, and didn't realize how much I was disassociating. And you can't really disassociate and speak at the same time. It doesn't really work. So as Jaime and I went into the church and we stood before all of the Christian symbology and the open and affirming flag, I couldn't catch my breath, and I wasn't sure how I was going to do it. The next day, I didn't go to services. I waited outside until it was done, and then we were going to start our group. And walked inside the church and sat down. with 10 to 12 other people. And the first thing I told them was, I'm not real comfortable here, and here's why. And they were surprised, but you could see as a welcoming church that Pilgrim just is, they wanted to do their best to make me feel at home. So Jaime and I handed out the child-friendly faith charter. And I don't know if all of you know that we have this charter on our website, and we're hoping that churches adopt it. So you can go on our website and pull it down and read it if you'd like. It's got 5 paragraphs, and what we had decided that we would do is we would begin to read the paragraphs one at a time, and we would pause in between, and Jaime and I would share stories with this group so they could hear kind of what the opposite effect of not adopting that would be. And so I talked about corporal punishment. I talked about some of the biblical stories I heard way too young, and we interjected it. And it was interesting, both from being a survivor in the midst of a faith community, but also watching the faith community at the same time. It was a little tricky. So as I began to tell my stories, I could see their faces just go blank. And in fact, we got done with the first segment, and a woman asked to speak, and she just sat there dumbfounded and said, "But God is love. That's all I've ever known, is God is love. I don't understand." And I didn't have very nice thoughts about her at that moment, and I was smart enough to know to keep them in my head, but I didn't really want to hear that God was love, because that's not what I had experienced, and yet I knew, from coming from a compassionate place, that we had 2 different experiences. And so as a congregation as a group started to work through that, everyone's experiences, we delved deeper into neglect and maltreatment. And pretty soon the group went into all these stories about, I was at Costco and I saw this woman with this cart and this little kid, and oh yeah, and I was at the school and I saw this. And Jaime and I looked at each other and we're, no. This isn't what we're talking about. We're talking about institutionalized abuse. We're talking about abuse and maltreatment that's baked into your doctrine, or to doctrine in general. And we want to bring awareness to that. So we did a lot of reframing. We did a lot of, well, wait a minute, come back. Because as people are starting to tell these stories of Costco and in schoolyards, they're beginning to get emotional and they're upset about it. And yes, we want to help. And they're going down the wrong path passionately. So we gently brought them back and reframed it. No, we're talking about abuse that happens in the church. And at one point, the pastor, who I, by the way, was raised to have pastors in my old community were people you didn't argue with. So this was a very interesting experience for me. So this pastor and I had a very respectful disagreement that, he was saying, but abuse happens out there with all these human beings, and that's what we are in here in a church. We're human beings, so you're going to see abuse in church. And so again, reframing and bringing him back to, no, I'm talking about maltreatment. I'm talking about specific, and I would go back to talk about the examples. One of the reasons I'm afraid to be in churches is that in my church growing up, when children weren't behaving, they were taken as little as infants, toddlers, and young people, and you could hear them screaming outside of the door. So one of the things that I was really worried about is, where's the nursery in this place? Because it'll send me right out of here real quick if I hear kids crying. And so as they started to think a little bit more, and especially when we started, I shared with them my experience with Abraham and Isaac, and they sat back, even the woman who, God is love, she sat back, wow, and you could see them start to transform as we kept reframing. And they began to grasp this, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, what can we do to help? If we see someone like you, what would we do? And I had to explain to them that if they did see someone like me, I was pretty isolated. And one of the things that about people like me as a survivor, I wasn't really helpful when I was little, because if you asked me why I had marks on my body, I would tell you the exact line I was taught to say. I didn't know that it was wrong. So I wasn't sometimes we have pictures of people who are in abusive situations that they're just rattling at the bars to get out, and then they're going to, run to the first person and ask for help. That's not what I did. I was very, very much aware of what was happening, and it was for my own good, and I was to be grateful for it, and I was not going to go out and complain. So then, we began to talk about, getting to know, if you suspect a child is experiencing abuse, get to know them, ask questions, be curious about them. And so we talked about that for a little bit. And then the church started to say, well, what about our Sunday school material? Do we teach about Abraham and Isaac? What do we say about those two? And it's like we're gonna need to evaluate that. We don't want to be traumatizing unintentionally children. And then the conversation went, well, where is our parenting classes? And the pastor was, I don't think we teach parenting classes. Do we know? It was like the church, once they were able to go past God is love to it can happen and we want to help, then it was like we want to do something. And I was incredibly touched, and it was definitely a life-changing moment for me to be with that faith community and to feel their warmth and concern and just wanting to help and wanting to do the right thing and wanting to learn more. And it was inspiration in working on the training program that our organization is putting together. And it's been with me as I build this out, and it's given me hope that there are people out listening and there are people out willing to help and wanting to have that conversation. We just have to hold up our end and have the conversation with them. Thank you.
Well, I guess what I would just add to that was hearing from people afterwards. I mean, it's hard to measure, but I know that when anyone brings their own experience, my own experience of hearing others, that it opens up, it gives me permission a little bit more to acknowledge and then to speak to my own. And so it was very powerful that we could create the space and that Bethany could, both of us could talk about our experience as teachers. And that's another dynamic in how to help people. Sometimes it's difficult if someone's in the middle of their own pain and processing or reacting to really be teaching. So we're coming from a different place, I think, in our own journey. But I did get a couple of people wrote me just recently. So this was several months ago. And one person spoke to the charter for child-friendly faith. He said, it was right on with my values and said things that I would have wanted to say about the topic, but I probably wouldn't think of. I also think that all groups need some kind of document like this, but our kids especially do. They need someone or something to speak for them because most of them are not in a position to do so and not ready to speak for themselves. I see the charter speaks very well for them. So that was really validating. And this is someone who, I don't think he was with that right away. I think it took some time to percolate. And this person I know has spoken about his ongoing evolution, coming from a fairly conservative place in Nebraska to where he is now. Another person said, I was moved by the courage of participants who were willing to share their stories of abuse for the purpose of education and prevention of harm. I was encouraged that Pilgrim already practices many ways to support children in healthy faith community. One, we encourage children to ask questions. We don't tell them what to believe. We have a policy about sign in to their Sunday school class and accountability for their safety. And I know, so I was just glad this is one part of our ongoing education that helped provide some cognitive dissonance for people who are really active and do good, people doing a lot of good. So we can always continue to build. So, and I don't know if later, if they would know that the Abraham and Isaac story is.
So my experience with it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So thank you. I was about 4 or 5 years old, and my father was an illustrator, so he was always drawing all these figures, and so I used to spend a lot of time in his office. I always thought it was a magical place. I liked to watch him draw. And so I came to his office after I had been to Sunday school, and I had colored in this picture of Abraham and Isaac. And Isaac is laying on, in this picture anyways, he was laying on a bed of wood. He was tied painfully so that his chest was arched, and Abraham has a knife poised above his heart and is ready to plunge it. And behind Abraham is this angel saying, whoa, whoa, wait a minute. And I didn't really get the feeling that Isaac was in a very safe place. And so I waited until I had some time in my dad's studio, and I went over and was hanging out with him, and I broached the subject and explained about the picture I had colored and what did it mean. And my dad's talking about it, and my dad he was a man who didn't understand how to use the language for 4-year-olds, so he used very big words and very large concepts. And so I'm trying to ponder what he's saying, and finally I just asked him the question I just wanted to know. If God asked you to sacrifice me, would you? And my dad laughed very nervously and said, children are always asking the tough questions, and you could tell he was trying to figure out what to say to me. And he said, well, I'd have to say, I hope God would resurrect you. I hope he would bring you back. I hope that there would be a bigger plan, but I'd have to say I would need to obey him. To understand what this felt like for me, you have to understand that in my household, God did a lot of talking, but I never heard him. I only heard him through my parents. So as I would interact with my family, I would find out what God said, and I didn't always like it. So now I was in a position where my father was going to be obedient to God, even to taking my life, but I wasn't going to know, just like Isaac probably didn't know, when it was going to happen or if it was going to happen. So all of a sudden, I was in a precarious place where bad things would happen to me, and bad things already did happen. We were hit to the point where we couldn't sit, and we couldn't, taking baths and things were very uncomfortable. So I already knew that God was capable of quite a bit. So when I heard about Abraham and Isaac, that was the end of the trust I had in my dad. It's never been the same.
So the challenging thing, I think, for persons of faith who've had a good experience of religion or spirituality is to hear such things, and we want to make it better. And as the example that you shared earlier, there's that cognitive dissonance. So that so was not my experience. And so there can be this initial pushback of not needing to know that that is something that is capable of when something we've experienced is so positive. We don't want to know that the negative is also a potential impact that can happen. And so a lot of defensiveness can come up in faith communities with persons of faith when we're trying to talk about child maltreatment that has a religious component to it, or a purely religious bent. And so the challenge can be how to be with that initial posture of defensiveness, with that initial response of, no, that's not what happens, or it can't be. And what a challenge, especially for those who have experienced maltreatment that's religiously based, or who have worked with those who've experienced maltreatment. And so we do get it, we do understand, we do believe it, and we do know that it's possible and happening, and we feel the energy inside of us that's passionately protective of the fact that, yes, this does happen, and yes, this did happen to me. And so the challenge for survivors, or for those working with survivors, the challenge to sit in that space, because in the abuse dynamic, I'm sure I don't need to tell this room, the dynamic of reality being denied, the reality of the victim being denied, this isn't happening to you, or yes, it's happening, but here's why it's your fault, or here's why it's good and right. And so some of the key components that are used to keep victims in the victim role can get re-perpetrated upon them when we're trying to have a conversation with someone who doesn't understand. And so how do we make safe space for these conversations to happen so that anyone in the room who has experienced maltreatment, or who, again, has that secondary trauma, that vicarious trauma, because we've worked with those who have experienced maltreatment and we feel with them, from being triggered and traumatized further by having that reality denied one more time when persons are first trying to crack through their cognitive dissonance that says, no, really, I can't know that this happens. I need to not know this. And I think that might be one of the largest barriers that I've seen in faith communities conversation. It feels so threatening that we just can't go there. So I appreciate the gentleness and the patience and the courage for both of you to sit and hold that space, and for the community, the faith community, Jaime, to sit and hold that space and to wrestle and struggle through it together so that it could turn into a transformative experience rather than a difficult one. I know you and I've had the conversation about, both personally and professionally, the challenge of when the first response is when someone says, well, if you just knew my God, well, if you would just come to my faith community, well, if you just knew the way I practice religion, then it would all be okay. And again, I get it that the intention is to be helpful and to say, but it's not all like that. But again, without meaning to be, how much of a denial of that person's reality is it? Well, you're even more isolated because yours were unique. Yours was a unique situation. When abuse survivors are already feeling isolated, we make them feel even more isolated by saying, well, you were just the exception. That doesn't happen a lot. It was just you. Ick. And so how do we find language to have these conversations? Because again, I've heard, and even at times within all of our conversations with well-meaning, informed individuals, I've heard some of us say, well, if you would just come to my church, it wouldn't be like that. And of course, that's what we want to do. We want to make people feel better. But sometimes it's really more about dealing with our own discomfort and not being present with the discomfort that another has experienced. So how do we help in a community, in an organization, a group of people, find enough internal emotional competence to sit with their discomfort long enough to not need to push back and be defensive, to not need to fix it and have to make it all okay, to not explain it away or justify all of those emotional defense mechanisms that we just all use that can be very adaptive. How do we help make certain in these situations that it doesn't go amok and further perpetrate violence and trauma on those who have directly or indirectly seen the impact? And so that's what we want to talk about a bit here. Yes.
I just wanted to add, I was talking to a very dear friend last night, and we were talking about language and naming things, and Jaime was talking earlier about naming things, and I think that that's another barrier, not, it comes very close to the one that you were talking about, Carla, where, redemption might mean something to you, but someone coming out of a closed community, an isolated community, it might mean something completely different. So when I was seeking out help, I went to churches and I used the language that I understood, and they heard it completely different. And I know even with Pilgrim, having an understanding that we don't use the same language, we may not mean the same things, words may sound similar, but redefining them so that we can have the conversation, I think, is critical.
And in the example that you shared about Abraham and Isaac from the Judeo-Christian traditions, and we've also discussed the example of Noah's Ark. Is that story being told in a faith community? Is it being told in a way that people, or children especially, are hearing about it as being about covenant promise and a new start from tragedy? Or are they hearing that if you act badly enough and hack God off enough, God's going to kill everything and everybody, and even all the puppies and kitties, except for 2 of each kind? How is it that children in our midst are hearing the words that we use in our communities of faith? They're the stories that we tell that is our way of communicating what we believe to be the truth about the divine and how we live and show up in this world and interact. But the way that language happens, we get to be mindful of how those words are landing on our children and how they're landing on those who've experienced religiously based maltreatment. And so how do we work together and wrestle together in these conversations to have a language, to just be mindful of the fact that, because we are going to misstep. We can go ahead and just get over that. So that wasn't Salvador Dali who said, have no fear of perfection. You will never achieve it. And so we can let go of our fear that we're going to screw up, because I'm just going to go ahead and break the barrier right now. We're going to screw up. We're going to make mistakes in the midst of these conversations. We will not do it perfectly. But I know for me, from my experiences, if I know that someone is trying to see me and hear me and understand and connect and go there with me, and that they're well-intentioned in that sense, it is easier for me to forgive, even though we may have bad thoughts in the moment. It can be easier to be a little more patient a little bit longer, because we can trust that their intention is to try. They're not trying to do harm. And so if people know that we're honestly, open-heartedly seeking to have the conversation, it can go a long way.
Mm-hmm.
Let's stop here for a moment. Maybe stop for a bit for some questions and comments and have some conversations about other barriers that you've seen or experienced in faith communities and ways of overcoming some of those barriers that we've experienced. So I'm going to go to the floor and bring one of the microphones out with me.
Yeah, so this is a real invitation. It said in the beginning that I hope we'll share experiences and learn from one another and really be more of a learning, healing community. So in the spirit of that, teaching is not just about talking, but really is more about listening, and learning is more about talking.
One thing that I see in common in my patients who have been sexually abused by clergy is that there was always shame around sexuality. It wasn't discussed, and no matter what the faith was. And what you don't name, you shame. And it was, there was no discussion of healthy sexuality. There's no discussion of teaching children, anatomical names for their body parts. I mean, we teach them this is a nose, this is an ear, and this is a cookie. That teaches them that I should be ashamed of those parts. And something as simple as far as prevention is to open that dialogue about sexuality. I was lucky to go to a very progressive church. But when I was a teenager, we had a new minister come into the church who was a 33-year-old single man, Charlie. And I remember one of our first conversations, he in our youth group said something about being responsible with your sexuality. And I was like, and this was a liberal church, but that's just not anything was ever approached. And I think that we have to approach sexuality.
One of the greatest sources of prevention is to have children and teens who are comfortable having the conversations and know that they have adults around them who are willing to have those conversations. Yeah. They have some place to go with it. They can speak about it.
It's confusing time and, all that kind of, and to be able to go to your faith community and say, hey, what's going on here? Is this normal? Well, then if something inappropriate happens, they know that they're going to be accepted, that it's not going to be a taboo topic, that it's not going to be totally off limits.
Exactly. Excellent. Thank you.
I want to just comment from my experience working with people in cults, as I was in a cult, and just how many religious institutions are not educated at all about cults and how do they act and what kind of trauma what's it like growing up in Scientology, or what's it like growing up in the Moonies, or any number of other cult groups. And as I was listening, I was connecting some dots, because there's so many people who've been abused in religious cults that want nothing to do with spirituality and have the kind of reaction Bethany was referring to of just trigger and stay away from this, and just how healing I believe it is and would be to invite former members, whether it's of the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons or the Moonies or whatever, to come in and even just share testimonies, what was it like growing up in my world, to kind of connect the dots also with then the sexual abuse and the other kinds of abuse. So this has been very helpful for me to listen to. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. And I think with clergy sexual misconduct that's been in the media more in the last 10 years, I've seen a lot of faith communities who are so anxious about the bad press that the institution of religion is getting. There's this really quick distancing that's going on of, oh, no, we're not like them. We're going to spend our energy spending so much time saying, no, that's isolated cases. It doesn't happen much, and we're not like that, that it puts the blinders on, and we go into this unconscious incompetency because we're not willing to face the fear and struggle with it. And so we're so afraid of our doors closing because we're going to lose money and people are going to go away that we shut down rather than open up and saying, yeah, this sucks. How do we talk about this? How can we as a community be a part of the solution rather than the shut down and become part of the fear? How can we discuss it? And I think that wouldn't drive people away, but would draw people to when people see persons of faith actually wanting to engage in the conversation and, goodness forbid, be a leader in making things better. I mean, isn't that kind of what we're called to do?
You could help me out if you could just define what you mean by the word cult.
My definition is an authoritarian pyramid-structured group that uses deception and mind control to keep people dependent and obedient. Behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control to make people dependent and obedient on external authority figures. So it's not a theological definition. It's very much a human rights-oriented definition, including things like teaching thought stopping or phobia programming, telling people they can't talk to former members, they can't read literature that's critical of their organization.
There's a wide spectrum of those issues, from isolation,
Exactly.
authoritarianism, and
It can be
shaming.
a cult of one, it could be a mini cult, it could be a political cult, a religious cult, it could be a therapy cult.
And the child development experts in the room will know this best, and the clinicians in the room, is that those are some of the greatest predictors for abuse occurring. It really makes the field right for a child to be abused is when they have experienced shame, authoritarianism, they can't push back, can't speak back, and they're isolated. It's a perfect breeding ground for abuse to occur. Yes, ma'am.
One of your slides said that church leaders are not prepared to deal with offenders and victims. And so what level, at the seminarian level, entry into orientation as staff at a church, where does that happen, and where can we as advocates enter into that dialogue with them?
Of all of those places that you mentioned, yes. We're not doing well. We're not doing well at all. I worked with a group. One of my degrees is in health education, and we did a study of accredited seminaries in the United States, Protestant seminaries in the United States, and found that an abysmal number, and I apologize, I don't have the stat on the top of my head, actually had conversations about sexuality, or even one course in one class. So like a 50-minute course in the midst of, or class in the midst of a whole course. A very small percentage had even that much of a conversation about any issue of sexuality. So clergy are not being prepared at all. More is happening, especially in light of the scandals of the last decade. More is happening, but it still is really challenging, and I think we need to, especially at the seminary level, to help clergy engage in those conversations as well as in faith communities. So let's get all of them, but if it would help if we could embed it into there's some movement to try to embed more of that into the curriculum of accredited seminaries in this country.
For current clergy, because of lawsuits and so on, and hopefully some sense of responsibility, there is more mandated boundary training that people participate in every several years, depending on their group. But too often that's limited to the individual themselves and not dealing with the dynamics, not dealing with the congregational education piece that needs to happen so people have a language, people understand boundaries, people understand how they're using authority or not, and so on.
One here and then some over here. Let's start.
Okay. James Dobson, he writes books that more people read than anything else. And he's considered a minister, but he's not. He has a PhD in developmental psychology or something, but they consider him like he's a minister. But the religions, especially the real conservative parts, are so strong that the politicians they don't try to protect children in the laws that they do, and the part of the danger, I think, is that our laws are driven by a small group that scares people. But I'm just saying, like James, I've been in bookstores. I've been a groupie at bookstores, and his books sell more than any other child development book. I mean, every bookstore has like 5 or 6 of his books.
Exactly. And that definitely speaks to the problem. As far as the solution, that's where we're talking about how we engage clergy in these conversations to help enlighten and broaden their perspectives so that we can have more people, a stronger contingency of people who are willing to have the conversations than of those who are willing or able to be managed by fear. We want to be able to encourage those conversations. Yes, ma'am, and then we'll come over here.
So I've taken some of the things from the faith I grew up in, and I think are good things, like not living with a man until you're married. What I've experienced because of this For example, me and my daughter were selling Girl Scout cookies at a nearby market. This guy came and bought cookies. Then he kept showing up at our house for more cookies. Started to make me a little nervous. So I took his license plate number and I looked it up on the internet. He had not just been a sex offender, but he had aggravated sexual assault. For any of you that don't know, aggravated sexual assault is where someone grabs a child, pushes them down, physically rapes them. So my question is what are you doing to protect women in your community? Like me, I was raised, with Jesus and love everyone, and I always gave everyone, like I look at everyone, I don't think about hating anyone. I think about giving everybody love and attention and forgiveness. And I want that forgiveness for those people too. But are there some things that you could do, like protecting the addresses of women within your church? Or not maybe the trust community, like everybody's forgiven. I think that's what creates abuse in churches. Everybody's forgiven, everybody's on this path. So we're just going to let everybody be alone with children. When a woman is getting raped every 6 minutes in America.
We talked about education related to sexuality and body. That may be a difficult entry point for some places. Maybe a different entry point is elder abuse. Maybe it's cyberbullying. Maybe it's domestic violence. And so any number of things that can add up to kind of nourish or nurture along a group to have more and more and more conversations that lead then to actual practices that are reinforced by actual resources and institutional responses and policies. And I mean, a little bit later on I can talk about some of the things that we're actually doing that are directly related to that, having formal responses where people actually sign to say, I will do the following if I see these things. So I'm saying there are all these different ways that we build up this safety net, and that's an environment where people are less vulnerable to begin with, as well as ways to respond. So I think
I hope so. Like my dad's an ex-police detective, and he's like, now that I'm in the Jehovah's Witness church, that's not going to happen anymore. I'm like, I don't want my kid in that church because there were 25-year-olds dating 14-year-olds. Look what happened to Miley Cyrus because of that. Mm-hmm. Her experience, where she is now compared to before she dated somebody too old for her. Mm-hmm. And he's like, well, I'm not going to let that happen. And when we went to visit, he's like, don't let her go to the bathroom alone. This place is open to the public. And immediately I could see who he was talking about. But there's other social things like, because I'm open and upfront about these issues, there was a Girl Scout dad that was a sex offender. And I knew it because I look up people's addresses before I go to other people's, or let my kid go to other people's houses. But I didn't tell anyone because he stayed away from, he didn't come to troop events. Well, then they were going to have an event at their house. Somebody reported it. It wasn't me. But because I'm upfront about talking about rape issues and stuff like that, they thought it was me, so they brought him to my house. So then you've got the community, not only we're going to accept people in and we're going to try to help them and let them be saved, but they're also pushing other people to be like, you've got to accept him into your community too. And like what she was talking about is how people are re-traumatized by that. Like I literally, that's scary. That's my home. That's my safe net.
And that's where our goal is. There are more of the organizations that provide liability insurance to faith communities that are doing more things like requiring there to be background checks on any person who's going to be working with any child in any capacity in that faith community. Volunteer or paid. They are making more safe place rules for the faith community, that an adult is not to be alone with a child. And so they're doing more of those things that are creating more safe spaces, and that's part of what the Charter for Child-Friendly Faith and more of what we're trying to develop within the designation program is a way to help faith communities think through, are they making a safe space in terms of their language, in terms of their theology and how that's being communicated to children? Are children being taught not to speak back at all against adults so that if something goes against the grain and doesn't feel right to them, they feel like they can't say? Are we unintentionally setting them up to be victims? And how can we put protective measures in place? So thankfully that's happening more, but we need it to happen even more. And so I'm glad you raised that, because we're not there yet. We still have a long way to go. Go ahead, yes, please.
Some of the things that we need to bear in mind are what are the practices of our faith community that we currently attend, or if we're looking at going to a new faith community, what are the practices that are there? I think a very effective thing can be to just ask to sit down with the leader of that faith community and ask that person, tell me what your thoughts are on this, and really almost have it be an interview type of process. And it can even be an education opportunity. Whenever my wife and I are considering going to a new faith community, we don't go there unless we have had a conversation with the leadership of that community to know where they're at. Additional things, you talked a lot about having the congregation be aware of child maltreatment issues and having that discussion. What I've pushed for in churches that I've attended is we're having that discussion and doing that presentation in the youth group. And we're informing the kids in the youth group. And that way, if anything questionable starts happening in the youth group, well, we've already had the conversation with the kids, and we've already told the kids, you let us know. We're telling you that as a church. You let us know. So having those things can be really important. And also another good strategy is a lot of times counties will have trainings that they offer for mandated reporters. Pretty much across the board, what I have found is that when they send out notification of these mandated reporter trainings, they send it out to therapists, social workers, and such. They don't send the invitation to churches, even though pastors are mandated reporters. And so when I'm aware of the trainings coming up, I talk to my pastor and I say, there's a training coming up. You coming with me? And so these are things that we can do to raise awareness within our faith communities, to raise awareness in kids in our faith communities, and just increase the safety that are there.
Thank you. I guess the image that comes to mind of organizational change, at least in some ways, is that an individual voice can be like a candle in the wind, but to bring in someone else or a group of other interested people, maybe more like the candles on a birthday cake, it'll light up, but not as powerful as if people actually join and start to think about what are we going to do differently and how are we going to maintain. And so we're talking about cultural change in our own organizations, and I really appreciate those who have brought up your passion and strategies, because that is a part of how the organizations start to grow and stretch.
Jaime, I wanted to respond to or ask you a question about something that you had mentioned. My name is Zev Smason. I'm a rabbi of a community and of a congregation in St. Louis, Missouri. And since our last board meeting, we've had in our last conference, we've had a number of interesting experiences in our congregation. One was that over the course of this past year, we became aware that there was a person who had become a member of our synagogue. And then after a period of time, someone found out that he was a registered sex offender and had not made that known to me and had not made that known to the individuals in our synagogue before he joined. So we were now presented with the situation of a man who's married, who is a member and actively participating, and he was a registered sex offender. So there was a very interesting and heated discussion between myself and some of the members of our executive board, in which we discussed what it was that we should do with him. And I'm interested in hearing, Jaime, what the resolution was of the situation which you mentioned, which I don't think I remember. I don't think you said what the decision was that was made. But if I may, I'll just continue with this with the story. So there are some very interesting perspectives that were shared. No one suggested that he should be kicked out of the synagogue, but several people advocated strongly that he should be allowed to be able to come and to participate while being monitored at all times by his wife always being with him, somebody accompanying him even to the bathroom, etc. But there were a few people, myself included, who felt that while he shouldn't be kicked out and told that he couldn't come, I and a few others felt very strongly that he should not be present at any time when children were present. And not that there was as much of a concern that he would be or pose a danger, but that the knowledge of his presence, which would eventually leak out to other people, would traumatize the parents and perhaps the children as well, in knowing that there was a sex offender who was in the synagogue when there were children who were present. And the reaction would be of the parents knowing that there was such a person there was something that I and a few others felt that was very important. Then the counterpoint that we argued was, well, he's done his time and he's inert, so why should he suffer the consequences now at this point of being excluded from the community? And my response was, actions have consequences, and he made a decision that was a terrible decision, so why should the parents and the mothers especially suffer from the trauma of seeing an individual who they know has done a horrible thing and having that concern lurking in the back of their mind? So the decision that we then made was that he was welcome to come, and it remains welcome to come, but only at those venues where there are no children present. So that means our major prayer services, which take place on Saturday, he's not welcome, so he comes only very early in the morning to something, or on occasion something very, very late at night. And he was unhappy, but I think that to his credit, he does come to a few things as well. So, Jaime, I'm interested in your reaction to our thought process, as well as if you'd like to elaborate on what the decision was that you made and your church made.
So at the time, we had no resources. We had an individual or an existing group, governance group, that made decisions, and I think very badly. So we're thrown into this crisis. So now, and this is what I hope every congregation would have, is an oversight team that have some competencies, have some real passion, and have the authorization to create and continue to assess policies and educational practices that will prepare people for these awkward or triggering, traumatizing experiences. So that group is in my mind kind of, I said, what image? This is like the soul or the heart of an organization that pays attention to the well-being, the overall kind of learning of the community. The next slide is, call it the immune system. And so instead of an individual or some existing group, that again, there's a group with a skill set and authorization to do work on behalf of the community, so it's not, at least in a congregational setting, I mean, everybody wants to get involved in decision-making and lose their mind, and then it's very fragmenting and difficult. So this group is authorized on behalf of the larger to find out the background, to consider specific limitations. We call them covenant of limited access, and that's offered and agreed to or rejected with those people informed, and the congregation knows that a covenant has been offered, or there is someone who is in the process, and the terms are not publicized, but they are very clear, and it could be things like escorts and limited times. It may be even having some kind of alternative ways for that person to both have spiritual kind of guidance as well as other kind of support, as well as others who, if there's something that people do know, ways to offer particular support and healing to them. So by our own policy, as I would say to our own congregation once a year, we've had so many reports that the response team has responded to, and at this time we have no active covenants of limited access, or we have one covenant of limited access. And so that's as much as I would say. And a lot of people wonder, well, is he still here? And the sad thing is, whether the person's there or not, there's no so maybe we have a healthier, responsive place. But then what? Person goes anywhere and there's no communication and there's no way to have a kind of coherence between congregations. So We came up with a covenant-led access. Sounds like what you did, and it sounds like a really thoughtful, responsible, and difficult process. The idea is to protect both victims and those who are seen as perpetrators, in whatever case. I mean, and so our response here might deal again with elder abuse, or might deal with other kinds of intimidation, maybe even concerns about from any number of things, not just child sexual abuse.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, gentlemen. Yes, Jan.
Thanks. I really appreciate what everyone has shared. It's really valuable information, and I am left with a feeling that there is a lot going on that faith communities are doing towards this effort of wanting to bring some of these issues more out into the open. But one thing that I think I've been wrestling with for a long time, and I really don't quite know what to do about, is that regardless of what kind of policies and procedures that places of worship might get in place, oftentimes, out of obligation to satisfy insurance requirements, or they may speak about we must care for victims and that kind of thing. So often I hear that underneath it all, religious leaders feel that their duty, their obligation, their sometimes this is codified, that they feel that the most important duty that they have is to forgive and to save the souls of sinners. And that you therefore will have, some reaching out perhaps to a victim, that kind of thing, but that underneath all of it is running this idea that our real duty is to save those people who have violated the children. So please talk to that as best you can. It's a huge question, I realize, but I'd love to hear your answers.
Some of the circles that I work in, my faith community, my denomination in the Protestant tradition is not evangelical in the way it approaches things. So it is about issues of peace and justice and not about saving souls. And so in those circles, I hear a lot of, yes, we make room for people to be forgiven, and we don't usurp something greater that speaks inside of us that gives us some common sense that says don't freaking let pedophiles wander around unescorted in your faith community. I mean, so I hear circles where it exists as both. Granted, they're not as prevalent as some of the types of communities that you've talked about, but I do hear people who say, yes, love and forgiveness, and it doesn't mean we act stupid. It doesn't mean that we act irresponsibly. And so on the one hand, we have love and forgiveness, but we also have this strong history, especially not just especially, I don't want to say that, forgive me, in faith communities, using Judeo-Christianity as an example, this strong tradition of a prophetic witness, and that we're called to do more than just protect our own little organization and our own institution. We're called to be on the forefront when there's a need for social change. We're called to be that voice that speaks out and says, this is not okay. We're called to be that voice that speaks out and says, we are mucking this up and we need to fix it. And that if we're not also holding that obligation in check, if we're not doing that, then we are missing what is one of our primary responsibilities. So that is where, when I hear faith communities that are struggling with wanting to engage in this process, certainly we can talk about liability issues, certainly we can talk about bad PR, but I speak to them more along the lines of where are we being a prophetic voice, and if not us, then who? And if we can't do that, then we are missing something. So that might be a talking point to engage faith communities to say, let's look at this as our obligation. Forgiveness, yes. Love, yes. Acceptance, yes. Equality for everyone, yes. And where are we willing to stand up and say, this ain't right, and we need to fix it?
Carla, thank you. We're going to give Jan the last word as time to go. No last word? Last word, panel.
Sign up for the designation program when we talk about it later.
Check out the Child-Friendly Faith, the Charter for Child-Friendly Faith, because it covers all the things that we hope faith communities would engage in. And develop relationships with faith communities, seminaries, other places, and find ways to develop partnerships with them to encourage and educate them and see if you can help build relationships that will help them have these conversations.